everyone for having me. And oops, let me see here. Okay, continue. So I know she had asked me to talk with you all a little bit about grief and loss, but I thought before we got started on that, a couple of things I figured it's helpful to know kind of who I am and why I might be able to speak to you on this topic a little bit. And I know we're going to try to save time for some questions at the end. I have a few semi-rhetorical questions, but questions kind of scattered in the slideshow a little bit. So I'll try to pause, and if the moderator, if folks want to chime in or offer their comments, or if you're just talking as a group, that's helpful too. I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to discuss this topic as well. So like Sarah said, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and also duly appointed to Internal Medicine Division of Oncology here at the here at KU Medical Center and at the Cancer Center more specifically. And I've been here for about 10 years practicing. I did my undergrad and master's studying in clinical psychology, and then did my PhD in kind of the intersections between trauma and health, which is what got me interested in working in oncology. And part of my interest in oncology is training other psychologists in oncology and talking with them about how to navigate grief and loss, both the grief and loss we experience as providers, but also in helping our patients and the caregivers that we work with, and navigating grief and loss is a big part of the training I do, some of the research I do, and a lot of the clinical work that I do. And so I think that's probably one of the reasons why Sarah reached out to me. So I'm going to kind of go through some various aspects of grief and loss, focus on one of the more common theories around grieving that's had a lot of great research support to it. And at the end, I tried to also include for all of you some websites, some books, and even some films that touch upon these topics and can be a good resource for you to refer back to after the presentation and discussion as well. And I know Sarah has these slides, which she definitely has my permission to share with you. So if there are things, I know she's recording, so you can watch the presentation or others can, but if you want the slides to be sent, please reach out to Sarah, and Sarah, you're welcome to share these with anybody. So I wanted to start with just a few quotes around grief and grieving and loss that I find to be helpful and kind of point out some aspects of grief that we're going to be talking about today. Probably one of my all-time favorite books, and I think I included it in the resource list, is called Tuesdays with Maury. I don't know if anyone has read the book. It's a little bit older, but it is a non-fictional book by Mitch Albom, one of his first books. And he went back and interviewed and kind of worked with his mentor from college, a gentleman named Maury Schwartz, who had ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, and was in the later stages of his disease in his life. And so they talked a lot about just what that process of loss was like for him, of losing some of his function and so forth. So we're going to talk about some of those things. But I love Mitch's quote here of that death ends a life and not a relationship. And our relationship with the people that we lose, because we're a part of that relationship, it kind of remains in us. Dr. Oliver Sacks is a known neurologist. He recently passed away, but wrote several really great books. And this is from his last book. When people die, they cannot be replaced. They leave holes that cannot be filled for. It is the fate, the genetic and neural fate, so at that cellular level, of every human being to be a unique individual, to find his own path, to live his own life, and to die his own death. Something that I often talk about, and we're going to talk about, is that connection between grief and love. That grief and love are conjoined. You don't get one without the other. We don't grieve when we don't love someone. So we may learn like about a celebrity who's passed away, and we may have a lot of appreciation for their work or their music or their art or whatever, and say, oh, that's so sad, I feel bad for them, or I feel bad for their family. But we probably don't grieve intensely because we didn't have a personal loving relationship with that person. But those people who are really close to us, where we do have a personal connection and loving relationship, that's where grief kind of really, really comes. Tears shed for another person are not a sign of weakness. They are a sign of a pure heart. Only people who are capable of loving strongly can also suffer great sorrow, but this is the same necessity of loving serves to counteract their grief and heals them. So it's kind of this Tolstoy notes that it's both the loving that causes us to grieve the loss, but it also might be the loving that brings us out of our grief as well. So it's true, when it's all said and done, grief is the price we pay for love. So I hope that those can kind of be some food for thought and kind of a launching for what we're going to talk about with grieving. So I am going to pause and let the group, if people want to speak up, if Jeanette or Jane, if anyone wants to participate for a little bit here, kind of what does grief mean to you, and how is it presented to you before, or what comes to mind when you think about grief? Any comments from the crowd?
Yeah, we had one person saying that it's exactly what you were saying before, that grief is the price of love.
Sure.
Heartache is another part of grief.
Hard, yeah. And who grieves, or who's allowed to grieve?
Anybody who loved a person.
Sure, yeah. I think that's important. Sometimes we talk about this disenfranchised grief, that sometimes we're not able to grieve or not allowed to grieve, maybe if our relationship wasn't known or accepted, or maybe because of our professional relationships. I know sometimes the doctors, the nurses, and psychologists and people here that work with patients, when someone grieves, we can feel a little separated because we're not able, we might learn about a patient's passing and then have to go right into the next day of work or right into the next patient appointment. And so sometimes the grieving process can be delayed or kind of set aside. And I think that happens to other people in our personal lives, that, we want to grieve. And, I think there are times too when we grieve, even when there's not a personal relationship to that person, but we're grieving for something that's of high value to us. I think a lot of times people grieve when there's a big change that makes them feel like there is the loss or a big change. When and where we grieve. And, I think that this is something that in this past year in particular has been really challenging, is that we usually tend to grieve or want to gather. When we grieve, we want to be with other people who loved that person, who knew them. We want to share stories about their life and how they impacted us. And there's a sense of needing to come together. And we weren't able to necessarily do that in the same way. And while, I've had some patients and people who had to do more of a virtual memorial service or those things. And while they were helpful and nice, I had a lot of people comment to me that the physical touch, having people shake your hand or give you a hug or pat you on the back, or just being physically close to other people, we kind of need that as part of our healing when we grieve. And often we want to do that, fairly close to the loss. Sometimes we can't, but oftentimes, those grief rituals and ceremonies, things like funerals or services or memorials, happen, within the first few weeks after we've lost someone. Things are very fresh. We're grieving, we're suffering, but we need one another. And a lot of families and people have had to either, like we said, do a virtual, or have had to really delay that time. And I think there's good and bad to that. Sometimes we're able to do more of a celebration of the person when there's some time to heal the sharpness of the grief. But also it can be a little, a patient I was talking with, that her husband had passed of cancer, and I had kind of followed them, and she said it kind of felt like emotional whiplash, like just when she was getting to a little bit more comfortable place, and it had been several months, but they were finally able to have his memorial service. It kind of felt like she got whipped back into some of the harder parts of her grieving by having to kind of revisit those things. So I think when that happens and where we do it, how we're surrounded by people, really can make a difference. And it's important to seek out community and contact with others when we're grieving. And then maybe what makes it hard to talk about our loss. I'd love to hear from you guys about what might have made it hard for you, or what you think has made it hard for others to talk about loss.
Other people don't think we have any worse than they do.
Yeah, so other people think we don't have it any worse than they do.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Sometimes we can get into that bad comparison piece. And yeah, human suffering and grieving is not a competitive sport. There's no grief Olympics. We can't. And I think for a lot of us too, that can come in. People think, oh, they have it worse, or I have it worse, or whatever. Another thing that I find comes up for a lot of people, and Jeanette, if there are other comments, please don't hesitate to jump in and I can pause. But we often get emotional when we talk about grief. And for some of us, I know for some of my male patients, maybe being able to cry or feel comfortable crying around others isn't something they feel very comfortable with. Maybe they were taught as younger people or boys, like, you don't cry, you don't show emotion, you have to be tough. So having this loss that's naturally going to bring up those emotions and maybe make us tearful can be uncomfortable. So we can try to stifle that because we feel uncomfortable, or we may feel uncomfortable with other people's emotions. If they, unfortunately, sometimes it happens if we're talking to someone who's grieving a same or similar loss, that they, let's say a member of a family, the mother of a family passes away. Well, all the siblings, they all just, the brothers and sisters, they just experienced a similar loss. And so it's hard to lean on one another because all of a sudden we're trying to take care of each other and everyone's crying, and it can be really hard. There can be a lot of emotions. We don't know what to do with other people's emotions, or they don't know what to do with our emotions. And so it can make it really hard and fresh. And, we're going to talk about some of these other aspects of loss that mean where someone is at in their grief journey can be different. And so someone could be, at a place where they have more peace about the loss, while someone else in the family or someone else close to that person may be still feeling a lot of anger. And that's normal. We're not all at the same place in that grief journey at the exact same moment. And so being gentle with ourselves and gentle with others about that, I think, is very important. And can be frustrating and a point of friction sometimes in families. I can't believe so-and-so, they seem so like they don't care. Well, they may care deeply. They just may be at a different phase of grief that looks differently than the phase you're at. And I know a lot of people who are what I call emotional ducks, where on the surface, everything looks smooth, but underneath, maybe they're churning a lot and they don't know how to express that, or they only express that really in private, or they're kind of dealing with it in internally. So I think sometimes we don't know what might be going on under the surface for people as well when we're grieving. And we can, our own emotional lens can kind of skew things as well. So obviously we've touched upon emotion as a really key part of loss and grieving. And I think we often think, the first emotion often that comes to mind when we think of loss and grieving is sadness, but that's really not the only emotion that we feel when we have loss. We can feel a sense of sadness. We can also feel anger. We can feel a sense of guilt. Sometimes people blame themselves or want to take on responsibility, sometimes for things they can't control. Sometimes guilt is our way of wanting to be able to control things that we can't. Because if I'm guilty, it means responsibility and intention. Usually we don't actually have those things. So it's our way of trying to feel a sense of like, well, if it's my fault, then that means I could have changed it and I want it to be different, right? Sometimes people might even experience joy. If someone was suffering a long time with an illness, people may feel a sense of relief. They may feel gratitude. They may feel grateful that for that person's role in their life. Maybe sometimes if there are situations when someone passes away and someone doesn't, where we might feel a sense of gratitude of like, I'm so lucky that I was only injured, that other person, they died. That's awful, but I feel so grateful to still be here. The normal emotional reaction. There are a broad range of reactions we can have. We can feel nervous, anxious, and uneasy. We can have a sense of confusion of not understanding why these events passed or why this person is gone. Or we can feel frustration. Numbness is actually very, very common, especially in the early stages of loss, where we can have a sense of shock. Things can feel very surreal. I think a lot of people, if you've had a sudden loss or unexpected loss or even not, even someone who's really close to you that you're so used to communicating with, that you go to pick up the phone to call them and realize, oh yeah, I can't call her. She's not here. Or, the door opens at home and you expect it to be that person and it's not, because you're still in that numb state where things feel really surreal and it can feel, confusing and unsteady and kind of like we're waking up from a dream and we're not sure what has happened. We can also feel envy for people around us who may not be as close to the loss. Well, you still have your wife, or you still have this person in your life. Sometimes we can feel a sense of hope, fear. We often feel yearning for that person, or yearning for that sense of things being normal and feeling safe and feeling, regular to us. We can feel resentment. It's often emotionally exhausting. It can be physically exhausting. We're going to talk about some of the physical symptoms as well. Sometimes we can experience still a sense of connection. That first quote I said was that death ends a life, not a relationship, that we can still feel connected to the person that we've lost. And we can even feel despondent or kind of adrift. Are there any emotions that you've experienced through losses in your life that you don't think are on here? Or does anyone have any comments about this range of emotions? Does that fit with your experiences of loss in your life?
Are those emotions that you have felt?
Hurt, yeah. But we're adding hurt as well.
Sure. Oh yeah. That's a very, feeling hurt. Sometimes hurt by the loss, or sometimes hurt by how other people respond to the loss. If we feel like people are being insensitive to our loss, that definitely can be one. Good point. So the physical aspects of loss, we know that going through loss is a stressor, not just mentally and emotionally, but it's stressful for our bodies. Our brains and our bodies are not disconnected, right? We're all one whole complete person. So if our brain and our emotions are impacted, our body's going to be, and vice versa. So oftentimes people will report a sense of fatigue or heaviness, like things feel so heavy, or that I'm moving so slowly, or it's just hard to get the energy to do things. Sometimes people will stay in bed because they feel this such heaviness that kind of goes along with sadness, but can be at a different physical level. A lot of times it is extremely common, especially in those early days and weeks after a loss, especially a close loss, where we have sleep changes. Maybe it's hard to fall asleep. It's hard to stay asleep. We find ourselves waking a lot. Maybe we find our days and nights getting shifted because it's hard to sleep at night. So then I'm dozing off or napping during the daytime. Other times people, all they want to do is sleep. They just want to kind of curl up and rest, and as a way to get away from their feelings, or because they just feel so exhausted. Sometimes people can have GI issues. It can be a loss of appetite. It can be an increase in appetite, right? It can, and we're going to talk, and appetite changes on there. It can be that they have stomach upset, heartburn, diarrhea, ulcers, things of that nature. So our digestion can change because of stress that we're under. People might find that they feel full really easily, or foods affect them differently. Headaches, especially tension headaches, are more common for people to experience when they're under the stress of grieving. We noted appetite changes. Some people seek out food as a source of comfort, so they might find themselves eating more of those comforting types of foods, rich foods, or even traditional foods. Sometimes that's mom always made this, and so I find cinnamon rolls, and so I find myself just all I want to do is eat cinnamon rolls because it reminds me of her. It's a way to feel connected. Or the other way, I just can't even think of eating, or nothing tastes good or sounds good, or I just can't bring myself to do it. So it's not uncommon for people to have swings in their eating patterns. They may feel just a sense of general pain or discomfort that's not, sometimes it can be pains that you've already had made worse. Like if you have joint pains or muscle pains, back pain, it may get worse. While some people kind of describe it as just a more diffuse sense of my body just feels sensitive, or I have pain or discomfort that I can't really describe. They may feel a sense of muscle tension, especially when we're under stress. We like to carry a lot of muscle tension up in our shoulders and our neck. We may find ourselves kind of hunching over or pulling in. So stretching and releasing that can be really important. It's something that people often feel. And that sense of like lethargy, it's just hard to get moving, to get going. Can definitely be present for people. Again, for you all, anything that's not on here that you've experienced, or does this hold true, these examples of some of the physical aspects that you noticed in times of grief or loss?
I've experienced the need to keep busy, keep doing
Oh,
something.
sure. Yeah. So from a psychological point, we know that sometimes that keeping busy can be a way we avoid our emotions too. Of like, if I slow down and have to sit with it for too long, the waves of emotions can hit me. So sometimes the busyness is a way to get back into a regular routine and schedule and normalcy. But I find sometimes if it feels frantic, or I can't sit down, or it's really uncomfortable, it can be our natural reaction to that nervousness and discomfort of those hard emotions. It's not uncommon for that to happen. So sometimes we can have that physical agitation that may have some of that emotional agitation underneath it. Does that make sense, or does anyone have questions on that piece? It's not to say we need to stop all activity. I think it's where we watch for swings that are too far in either direction. I don't let myself slow down, stop, think, feel at all. Or I just lay in bed, I can't move, I'm not doing anything to care for myself. So those extreme swings are the things where I think it's important for us to be mindful of. So I think also, and I wanted to acknowledge, especially given for you guys as stroke survivors, many of you are caregivers of people who survived stroke, that we have a lot of other types of losses that we experience, and we still have grief reactions to these losses. These are things that are still, while it might not be a loving relationship to a person, they're still highly valued parts of ourselves, parts of our life, parts of our concept of our future. And so when these things are lost, we also have a sense of grief and grieving. Sometimes that's not acknowledged by others. Sometimes we may not even realize that that could be a driving force underneath some of what we're feeling. So we can experience loss of health, right? If we've had a health problem like stroke, cancer, injury, other illnesses that change our body's function, especially. So we can have a change in function around what we're used to doing, either those more large global motor functions like walking and getting around on our own, or talking and speech can be challenged. So those functional losses can be extremely difficult emotionally, aside from physical. And I think sometimes, the doctors or family caregivers around us can focus on the physical aspects of what's changed and forget how that impacts us emotionally to have that change. And when our health and our functions change somewhat, it changes our expectations we have for ourselves. It can change our hopes that we had for ourselves, the plans we had, the goals we were hoping for, what I thought I would be doing at this phase in my life, or in the next phase of my life may be very different because of what, or even the sense of how long my life might be sometimes changes with different types of health issues, and so forth. Because we're experiencing these changes, unfortunately, sometimes our friendships and other relationships in our families with our spouses and loved ones can also change. We can feel like that we've lost friends over this, or that we've lost relationships. We might have losses of careers or work status, not just, these are things that can be tied back to health, but that we might experience just throughout life, of other losses of people in our lives going away, moving away, maybe a breakup, as well as, losing jobs. But I find sometimes, even in reaction to health and functional losses, they can almost start, I've had a patient describe it as like a domino effect of loss. Like, first I lost this sense of health, and then my function changed, and then I had to rethink if I was even going to be able to go back to work. And that meant, this is what I thought I'd be able to save up for my retirement. And so that changed. And then, my friends that we always used to go and play golf together. Well, now because my functions changed, I can't do that. So I never see my friends much anymore. So I feel disconnected from them. And then who I see myself as a person, that are often made up by our hopes, our expectations, our hobbies, our relationships that tie into our identity. We can lose a sense of who I am. Who am I if I can't do these things, if I can't participate in this way, if I can't be productive, if I can't work, if I can't be in this relationship? Like, who am I? We can lose that sense of safety or control in our life when something unexpected has happened. Sometimes that can challenge people's faith or spiritual beliefs. It can also challenge their sense of worth or belonging. Can I still be a part of this group? Am I still a worthwhile person? We can lose our traditions, things we're used to doing. We can feel sidelined and on the outside of life. I wonder, when you think about some of your own experiences of loss and how you might have grieved these kinds of losses, would anyone like to share anything about a loss they experienced, or maybe how they recognize the emotional side of some of these physical losses?
Yeah, I said my mother a few months ago. It's very hard. It's hard to get over anywhere.
That was your mother or your brother? Mother. Gotcha.
But one thing that helps a lot is that you start thinking about all the history she did for, things she's seen and done. That was part of it. She was younger, first started planning and instead of that helps. I think it's very much true.
Yeah.
I think G.
Were you able to catch that?
I caught a part of it, but could you rephrase it, and then we might be able to get it on the recording better too.
Yeah.
G.
Right. So we were sharing here about the loss of a mother fairly recently, and the way that
Sure.
affected sleep and fatigue specifically,
Sure.
and also just sort of the thinking back on those memories of.
Oh, sure. Creates a lot of reflection points for us, and we'll definitely be talking about that. Anyone else have any examples of loss, maybe not loss of a person, but loss of other changes in life?
COVID, that's the
Oh,
loss.
sure, our loss of normal with COVID. Yeah, we definitely experienced a lot of the loss of this normal and safety.
This is probably like the loss of doing things with the
Go ahead.
grandkids, driving them, teaching them.
Yeah, not being able to do a lot of things. Sure.
Right, not driving anymore. Mhm.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a very big functional loss for people. And that's one of those domino losses, right? So if I can't drive, then I lose a lot of independence and free choice, and I can feel more dependent on others. And it can be, yeah, a domino piece of loss there. So, and again, you know, sometimes I think people focus on the practical piece of it and don't acknowledge or give themselves time or compassion to say it's emotionally challenging to have these losses, not just, you know, the functional, physical, I don't get in the car and drive, but what it feels like to not be able to drive and how that impacts me in my day-to-day living. You know, I think especially in the Midwest, where we're really a car dependent, you know, society here versus, you know, in some other countries or in larger cities, or on the East Coast where there's so much, you know, public transit that many people don't drive. Here, that's a really big challenge, or especially if you don't live even in the city proper, if you live a little further out, you know, or in some pockets of the city where there is not a lot of great access to that. So that can be a big life-changing factor. I appreciate that. That is a very big one for a lot of people in their health changes.
And there was consideration also of the way that
Oh, yeah.
being able to drive impacts relationships as well. For example,
Oh,
not
sure.
drive the grandchildren anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah. Now I can't help out or drive to see someone or meet a friend or do anything. Yeah. We're really so limited. Yeah. Not being able to do some of those things we really enjoy and engage with the people that we really care about. Exactly. So many of you may have heard of this. So this is a review of the classic stages of grief and loss. So Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross first published her work around the stages of grief and loss in 1972. So it's been around for a little while, but she had done some extensive research on people dealing with a wide variety of losses and grief situations and found these kind of common patterns that we experience. So it's a sense of shock and denial. And denial doesn't have to be, I think sometimes people think of it as strong as to not want to acknowledge that it's real, but also denial can come in smaller ways of just kind of, I don't want to talk about it, just leave me alone about it. It can be like that pushing it away. Denial can look a lot like avoidance sometimes. Anger. And that anger can be directed at a lot of things. Sometimes the anger is directed at the person that we lost. Why didn't they listen to their doctor about this? Or I'm so mad at them, or I'm so mad that they're gone. Sometimes it can be anger directed at people we expected to care for them. Sometimes it can be directed at other family members. Sometimes it can even be directed at God or a sense of spirituality or faith that this happened, this bad thing happened to this person we cared about, or this bad thing is impacting us. So anger is not uncommon. I find a lot of times people experience anger and then they feel guilty or they get critical of themselves of, why am I being so angry? Or it's not reasonable to be angry. Anger is a very normal part of the process of grieving our losses. Bargaining is another one. If only this would happen, then this. If we'd only done that. Sometimes this is an aspect of undoing, or I wish it had been me and not them, or if it had only been this. That if only kind of thinking or talking is an aspect of bargaining. Yeah, Jeanette, did someone have a comment? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Can you say that again?
It's hard to lose certain animals.
Right, it's also hard to lose certain animals.
Oh yeah. Oh, I am a big animal lover, and I think that They are part of our families. We have loving relationships and sense of connection with them, and especially a pet that's been in our family or been with us for a long time or may have helped us get through something. Those are very real losses. I think they're being more and more accepted, but I think sometimes those are losses we feel that we often feel we can't talk about, or maybe people don't understand, or we're not allowed to grieve that loss, but we are. That's a loss of something that was really important in your life. I'm glad you bring up that point, definitely. So we talked about bargaining as an aspect of grieving, depression, sense of sadness and hurt and longing and yearning and tearfulness that we can have. And then acceptance of kind of recognizing the reality. And acceptance does not mean I like this. It just means that I see the reality of it and where my life is moving on in this forward pattern without this person physically present, or without that person in my life in that same way that they were. So these are very common that we all can experience, but I want to talk about these a little bit more broadly and clear up, because there's some misconceptions about them that I always think is really important. But if you are interested in learning more about the grief and loss process or the theory, there's a good website for this in the back, and also Dr. Kubler-Ross's books, especially her seminal work on the stages of grief and loss is very, very good. And it's a fairly short, quick read as well. So the roadmap you expected with grief, and then the roadmap that you got. So this is something that I think throws people off, right? Is we heard that there's shock and denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance, and we think of these are going to move rather linearly, like they're going to kind of move in those steps and be smooth, and we're done with it. But what grief really looks like in our experience of it is, kind of like this other drawing, is a lot messier. We may skip steps. We may go through the same stages more than once. There are a lot of differences for people. So I wanted to walk through kind of some misconceptions about these stages of grieving to clarify. So the 5 stages are not linear. It's not you do one and then you're done with it and then you do the next one. So they don't necessarily go in order. It's not a linear progression of steps. So the stages are all equal to one another and they're not really in any order. Our brains, the way we learn, it's helpful to have them in some kind of organized fashion to understand, but the way we experience them is much more fluid. You might not experience all the stages with all losses. So some losses you may not experience anger. Some losses you may experience a lot of anger and not really experience as much depressed feeling. So this really varies both within the individual. Some people might tend to go towards one of these stages where they spend more of their time in grieving, but it can also change in loss to loss as we lose different people, lose pets, lose function, and so forth. So it's very common, and these stages can impact us in any area of grieving. So grieving the loss of a person, the loss of a pet, the loss of function, the loss of a job. We can experience these stages in any type of loss we're going through. The stages often occur more than once. You might feel angry for a while, then have a sense of acceptance, and then something may trigger a sense of anger again. It's not uncommon for there to be kind of these 2 years of grieving that feel different and intense in different ways. Often that first year of grieving is intense because of the recognition of the loss, right? That's when we experience a lot of what we think of as like the empty chair feeling, that at the Christmas gathering, the Thanksgiving table, at Mother's Day or Father's Day, at a birthday, we really notice the person is not here. And it's the first time of experiencing that, and it's very intense. The second year, oftentimes people will experience a new wave of intense grief in the recognition that they won't be here again. First we're kind of hit with the shock of the person isn't here. Then we're hit with the reality of, oh, and they won't be. And oftentimes other people further removed from that person are at a different stage of grief or not paying as close of attention. So that second year can be a time when we feel a little more alone in our grieving. So I think it's always important to recognize that and be gentle with ourselves and maybe seek out some support at that time, because that, the first year of grieving is hard in its way. And then the second year and moving forward can have a little bit different feel, because we may re-experience some of these same phases of grieving again. So the stages don't happen just once. We may experience them multiple times. But as we learn and cope with them and grow, they may be less intense. We may be able to recognize and move through them. The stages are a concept, not a rule. So it's not like, oh, well, I haven't bargained, so I better do that now. It's not something you can necessarily force yourself to do. They're very natural. Like we said, you might not experience all of them. So it's a way to conceptualize a lot of the things that happen with grieving, but it's not so set in stone. So important to know. Like I said before, people who are grieving even the same loss may be experiencing different emotions and be at different stages of the grieving process. And it's helpful not to judge ourselves and not to judge others for where they are at in that process, because it's a very individual journey. So if like in the instance, I know a gentleman in the back had kind of mentioned losing his mother, and he may be feeling a lot of sadness and depression, and another family member may be feeling angry. Or another family member may be in denial and just not wanting to talk about it, not bringing it up. I don't want to acknowledge it. And that can be hard, because we want to lean on each other, and we might be at different places in our own process. The emotions, like we said in the stages, are and in between are very fluid and tangled, and being gentle with ourselves about that, I think is really important. Anybody have any questions or comments on that?
Are you saying it can last for years and years, but basically you're saying it's easy? Is that what you're kind of saying?
Are you saying that it can last for years and years, but it essentially gets easier? Is that the gist?
For a lot of people, that's what they experience. Yes, that it's kind of still on an improving trajectory, but it's not a straight shot. That we often feel a sense of gradual healing and improvement and feeling sense of connection. And I think this next slide that we're going to talk about is going to really pull some of that together. So we think of it that we're often on a positive trajectory or path, but it's not a straight and narrow path. It's going to have those twists and turns as we experience those things. So the new stage of grief, which is around finding meaning, I can't recommend some of the readings from this author enough. His name is Dr. David Kessler, and he was a research assistant and then a colleague, and worked with Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who developed that first theory and the stages of grief and the research behind that. And he built upon this around finding meaning. And finding meaning is a way that grief can be transformative, kind of from love to grief and back to love again, is kind of the way I think of it. It is the bridge that grief can be, that meaning can be, to coming back to our sense of love and connection. So in finding meaning, what that person meant to us, what that relationship meant to us, how it changed us, how it improved us, or what we learned about ourselves or others from that, can help us to develop a sense of peace and more acceptance and calm. Again, that's not saying I like that this person is gone. It's saying that I understand that they're here, and it is less intense and less upsetting to me. I have a sense of peace about this loss. Finding meaning in our grief can help us have a sense of connection. It honors the loss that we experienced. It honors the loved one that we lost and their ongoing place in our lives. So I can share with you guys, I'm going to talk about hope, and then, and in that transformative nature of finding meaning and connection and peace, we can then redirect ourselves towards our life in the future, while keeping that person a part of our life and a part of our future in different ways. So I'm going to kind of share two really quick stories about this, and I want to make sure I save a little time for some questions, and we're almost through these slides. So my own grandfather passed away before I was even born. And so I couldn't grieve this loss, right? I didn't even know it. But my family, other family members, older family members obviously grieved, and they found a way to find meaning and connections. My grandfather worked as a barber. And so all of my aunts and uncles always told stories about sitting around in his barber shop and talking, and how he would pay them like a nickel at the end of the day to sweep up, and they would go run across the street and buy a soda pop with their money that they earned, and how it was just, they saw everybody in their small town come in there, and they would polish the barber pole, and that was a big part of the lore around him, so much so that symbol of a barber's pole has become kind of a tradition in our family. If family members are traveling for vacation and they see one, they'll take a picture of it, right? It's a sense of connection to him and this role that he had in their lives and in my overall family's life, so much so that I, to this day, even though I never got to meet this person, if I see a barber pole, I immediately think about those stories and him and all. So there's been meaning given to him and his loss and his life that helps our family to still feel connected, even members of the family that never got to meet this person. So I think, and I don't think my family sat down at any point and was like, here's what we're going to do, right? But that's kind of the stories and how they kept his memory alive. And then I had a patient that I worked with who his wife passed away, and they had a special restaurant that they always went to celebrate, celebrate anniversaries and birthdays for their family. And after the loss, it was really hard for him to go there. But eventually he went back for a family event, and the staff there really embraced him and said, we've missed you guys, and we really loved your wife, and we hope you're doing okay. And if it's okay with you, we have a picture of you guys sitting in the booth where you always sat. Could we put this up? We want your permission. And my patient said, oh my gosh, that's lovely. Sure, you can do that. And so going there and seeing her picture and sitting and eating and all, he realized, I didn't have any bad memories here. We always were celebrating. We weren't fighting. We weren't arguing. We were having a great time when we were here. And so now it's a sense of peace for him and a sense of connection. And he looks forward to bringing his grandkids there, bringing people there and showing her picture on the wall, and that this was this special place. So I think there are a lot of different ways, but that's just two little examples of how we sometimes can find meaning in a loss that allows us to maintain a sense of love and connection, not just the sense of loss. Not that that's not there, we honor that, but we honor the loved one, their life and their connection to us just as much, if not more, than their passing or the loss of them. Any questions, comments there for anyone, or does that ring true to any experiences that you all have had? So when we support people who are grieving and think about support for ourselves, did you have something? Sorry. I think it's important that we think about listening and supporting, that we don't need to necessarily fix this, and there isn't a fix, that we can't bring that person back, but sitting with those hard feelings, allowing that person to express their feelings, saying, I understand, you have every right to feel this way. I'm so sorry, this is so hard. We don't have to change this. Sometimes just sitting with them and being there can be even more powerful, offering to be alongside the person versus advising them or pushing them. Sometimes being honest, admitting I can't make this better for you and I can't take away the pain and I'm so sorry. Unfortunately, sometimes I think people jump in and try to, don't cry, don't feel this way. Of course we're going to feel this way. Allowing ourselves to feel our real emotions is healthy. We don't want to change those emotions. We want to recognize and honor the loss. And I think, sometimes it's helpful to say, I want to ask you how you're doing and how things are going. But if you want to change the subject, I understand. I think there's that fine balance, but sometimes being really explicit about, I don't want to make you talk about something you're not comfortable with, but I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room is this is your experience and what's fresh for you. So let me know what you feel comfortable with. I have a lot of people who say, it's really hard when people around them kind of like won't say their loved one's name anymore. Say, oh, well, how are you since? And they kind of fade off, not saying like, since John died, I know it's hard, and sharing stories about John and so forth. So I think being honest and open with others if we're supporting them, or telling people if we're needing support, it really helps when we talk about him and the meaning he had in our lives and all. But I don't want you to expect to have to talk about that only. You know, I want to hear about what's going on with you too. So sometimes we need to give people those cues or ask for them. And not giving a time limit. Grief is something that will experience. Like we said, it's on this, hopefully a trajectory of healing, but we could be at a different twist and turn, and not saying you should be over it at any point. I think that's not fair, and everyone processes their emotions and their grief differently and on a different timeline. And as we saw with the different aspects of grief, people could be at a really great place of acceptance, but that doesn't mean they're over or done with grieving. They might just be at a sense of calm for the time being, and not putting a time limit on ourselves for grieving either. So wanted to give I have 2 slides just on a couple of things that you can do for yourself to help with grief and loss, things that have been shown to be really helpful. Journaling, walking through your emotions, how you're feeling can be great. Obviously, I think therapy, I wouldn't work as a therapist and a psychologist, but I didn't think it could be helpful to people. Support groups can sometimes be helpful, or individual therapy or family therapy can be helpful. Reviewing your past success and coping with other losses. What helped you get through other losses in the past, or people around you? What did you notice about someone that you care about or admire, and how they handled that hard situation, or what's worked? And remember your strengths. You know, remember not only the difficulty you're going through, but your resilience of being calm and patient and compassionate with yourself to get through that. It's not something we can rush always, but if I know without a doubt that everyone on here has been through a hard time in the past. And if you hadn't figured out a way to get through it, you wouldn't be sitting with us today. So I know we've all figured out ways to get through hard things, and that's important to know. Didn't make it not hard, but our ability to get through it's important too. Focusing back on the what is, not the what ifs. What is going on today? What do I have that's good? Gratitude and humor can be great pieces of that. How to eat an elephant if we're feeling overwhelmed, breaking things down to one bite, one step at a time, and make that step smaller or that bite smaller until you feel comfortable. Just getting up in the morning sometimes is enough. Getting up and getting dressed, then getting up and getting dressed and eating something. So we wanted to make the process small and build on it if we're feeling overwhelmed. And then I like to think of the Lucy and Ethel test. You know, they were best friends and getting into trouble together. So thinking, what if my best friend were going through this, or someone really close to me? What would I want to do for them? And can I treat myself with that same kind of love or same kind of compassion, or seek out others who are going to treat me with kindness and compassion while I'm going through this? Sometimes we're harder on ourselves. Oh, you should be over this. Get over it. What's your problem? We can be harder on ourselves than we would ever be to a friend or loved one. So I think pausing to give ourselves some of the love and compassion we would give others is important. Taking action, kind of what are the behaviors they're saying? Practicing breathing can be great, especially if we're feeling intense emotions. Practicing relaxation, prayer, meditation, whatever feels comfortable to you. There are a lot of great apps out there. There's a great free app called COVID Coach that was developed early on by the National Centers for PTSD and Anxiety that has breathing exercises, relaxation exercises, mindfulness exercises, resources for dealing with anxiety and depression, and it's completely free. So that's a great resource. I encourage folks. There's Turning Point has lots of great classes and things online and resources that you can utilize too. So those kinds of things can be great. I think sometimes for us, not just the larger grief rituals of going to a funeral or a memorial service, but is there a personal grief ritual? Writing down a special memory of the person, keeping a special memento of the person, or of the pet, or of something in a prominent place, or a place where you can look at it or reflect on it, or keep it. doing pleasant activities, doing things that you enjoy doing, and keeping a list. So I think of this as like, I wonder how I would feel if I tried, and going to the list, going for a walk, if I tried calling a friend. Sometimes those things can be helpful. We talked about gratitude can definitely be useful. Having a normal routine to get up and get going for your day. Bodies at rest tend to stay at rest, bodies in motion tend to stay in motion. So, getting up and getting moving earlier and having routine and stability can kind of help our days run better. Regular exposure to sunlight, obviously medically safe. We want to use appropriate sunscreen or head coverings or clothing, but getting out in the fresh air, getting out and getting sun exposure can be really important. Making sure we're getting rest, making sure we're eating, making sure we're exercising. And exercising doesn't have to mean you go to the gym and hop on a treadmill for hours. It can be a brief walk. It can be a brief stretching, finding a way of moving around that feels good and is enjoyable to you. We know that pillars of overall mental, emotional, and physical health, kind of their 4 pillars. So I always think if you can keep these 4 things going, those 4 solid pillars can really hold you up. So that is sleep, getting rest, eating, getting some decent nutrition in, moving our body. Again, whatever way you like to move your body that feels good for your body is great. And connecting with others. We are pre-wired to be in connection with other humans. There is a reason that historically and even up to this day, one of our worst punishments are things like shunning, solitary confinement. It's because it is bad on our mental, emotional, and physical health to be apart from other humans. We learned that a lot this past year, how isolation is bad for us. So I think making sure we connect with loved ones is also really important for us. So eat, sleep, move, connect. Very important. If we're doing those things consistently, that can be the basis for really improved health overall, both our mental and physical health. So some resources, and again, Sarah will have these slides if you guys need them. There are several great online resources, websites that have resources around grief and grieving, grief.com, Speaking Grief, What's Your Grief, Mindfulness and Grief has some of those mindfulness exercises you can practice. They're only a few minutes long, so it's not hours of meditation. It can be a very brief one. And modernloss.com, I feel like they also incorporate some humor and levity, as well as some good resources around loss. Lots and lots and lots of great books out there. Some non-academic style books, a little less research-based. Tuesdays with Maury, I mentioned, is great. When Bad Things Happen to Good People is another classic. The Invisible String is a children's book talking about connection and loss for kids. So if you have kids in your life going through grief or loss, or who have someone they may be losing, like an aging or ill grandparent or someone, The Invisible String is excellent. I love that book. It's really sweet and brings it down to the kid level. Gratitude by Oliver Sacks is great. The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch is a quick book. He was a pancreatic cancer patient that kind of wrote about his, not just dealing with that, but living well when you have limited time and kind of finding what's really important to you. So it's a great one. And then a lot of people have seen it. It came out just a few years ago. Paul Kalanithi was a surgeon who also was diagnosed with lung cancer, and he wrote When Breath Becomes Air. All of these are fairly short, easy reads for sure on that side. And then if you're someone who likes getting into the weeds a little more research-based, more academic style book resources, On Death and Dying, that's the kind of seminal work by Dr. Kubler-Ross, Finding Meaning, David Kessler's addition to her work, Being Mortal. The 4 Things That Matter Most, that's kind of a bridge between kind of a more accessible, non-academic book, but he does back it with some of the research. Dr. Bayek does a lot of research in that area. The Other Side of Sadness and It's Okay That You're Not Okay, also a really great and quick read, but does have some tie-ins to the research. So highly recommend those. You all can probably name some good films, but here's a fairly good list of some classic films about grief and grieving. A couple that I always or that sometimes people haven't heard of that are really nice. So Endgame was a documentary that followed some patients deciding to go on hospice in their family. So it's a little bit different take. So it's more of a documentary style. Life is a House is also one that's not as common, but it's a gentleman. I think it's Kevin. Oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking on his last name. I can see his face now. He was in French Kiss. I can't think of it now. I lost it. It happens. But he knows that he's ill and hasn't told his family yet, and they're building this house together. And so it kind of becomes this metaphor for like trying to finish the things that are important to you and connect with family and leave them with something. So it's a little lesser known film, but is excellent, and I recommend that. And then there's obviously tons of films out there, but these are some that I have seen and recommend and come up often in lists about grief and grieving films. So I know we're probably kind of right down to the time, or we went over by a couple minutes. I hate to keep you guys late, but does anyone have any questions, comments, things I can be helpful with